right?
Yay!
Yeah. So I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I'm going to give him plenty of time, but I've heard, as I've told you, snippets of Dr. Jones's testimony, and then some other stories kind of tied to it, loosely tied to it. So I don't know which ones he'll use tonight, but I'm so looking forward to this. So, without any further ado, let's all welcome our own Dr. Jim Jones.
Am I on? Yes, you are. Thank you, sir. Well, I'm not sure what you all did to annoy your pastor so badly that he decided to let an old man talk. Well, first of all, you probably need to take out your cameras because you're looking at the most blessed man you will ever see. Let me, no, please. I don't get paid if you clap, so. Let me tell you my story. It hopefully will one day be published, but it's an unusual story that seems to captivate people. I was born a poor child. I'm sorry, I have a weird sense of humor tonight, but I'll try not to let it interfere. I was born in 1933. My parents, my father had gone to college, and after college moved to Buffalo, New York, from Robeson County, which is where I was born. Married a local girl there. They had a couple of children in New York, and the Depression came. My father had worked himself up in the automobile industry for an automobile that is now like the dinosaurs. It's gone. It was called the Pierce Era. Some more people are nodding their heads. It was America's answer to the Rolls Royce. And when the Depression came, of course, the first thing to go was the most expensive car, and they closed up. His parents, the Joneses, had moved from Florida back up to Robeson County, which is where they were from. And my grandfather, who was my hero growing up, could do anything. And so was really adept at building masonry things. In fact, at one time, virtually every church entrance, steps and the columns and everything in the county were built by that grandfather. Well, he built this beautiful two-story brick house on a little small farm. It was all they could afford, about 30 acres. When I grew up, I don't know, some of you older people may remember this, but when I grew up, farms were rated by how many horses you used to cultivate. It was a one-horse farm or a two-horse farm. By that standard, ours would have been a little billy goat farm. It was only about 30 acres. But and at that time, Highway 74? Is that right? 74 from Charlotte to Wilmington split our farm right in two. And so on the side furthest away from the house, my father realized that, well, things were not going to go well with the Depression, so he returned to where he'd grown up, and he knew that on a farm, you may be poor, but you won't ever go hungry. So they built him a small house on the back side of the farm, and I was the first child born in that house. It's been reconstructed. If you try to find it, you won't be able to. But anyway, we were happy. It's really great that when you're so poor you don't know you're poor, and that was the case with us. And we had plenty of fun. My father decided that he didn't want to be married to my mother anymore. Could I have a piece of candy, please? My medications make me have a dry mouth, so. And I keep asking for candy. So anyway, he had left and was living with some person across town. I'm fine. There were, by this time, 5 children, the baby of which was barely a year old. I was 5. My mother said one day that she had to go to town. We didn't have a car, or she didn't have a car. And so she left. And she left. And we sat, there was a tin-roofed house, very hot in the summertime, so we really went out on the porch to be cool. And of course, if you've been back to where you grew up when you were a child, things are much smaller than you remember them, because when you're a child, they're far away. But we looked down this long dirt road that led back to my grandparents' house. And my mother didn't come, and she didn't come. And started getting dark, and there was still no mother. And so finally, my sister, who was 4 years older, began fixing us a little something to eat. Don't remember that part of it. I do remember that out on the porch, she was rocking the baby, and she fell asleep while she was rocking, and rocked off the porch and fell in the shrubbery. And so she made us all go to bed. There was no mother. Some 3 days later, the widow lady who had the farm next to ours realized that we were alone and went over to the brick house to tell my grandparents that we had been left alone with no adult in sight. So my grandparents came over and gathered us up, and we went to live with them. My father was their oldest child, and so they asked him what was he going to do about the children. He said, I don't have any way to take care of them. I'm not interested in taking care of them. Put them in an orphanage. My grandmother said, I suggest that you get out of here quickly before I forget my manners, and because these children will never go in an orphanage as long as I live. My grandmother had been a one-room school teacher, and that act, while it may sound awful and bad and nothing to be glad about, turns out to be the most meaningful event in my life. Had I stayed with those 2 people, which were my parents, who could have easily have won an international contest for the 2 sorriest parents that had ever been born. But now we're in the care of this lady who had taught school, came from a very respectable family in the Lumbee Indian community, and married my grandfather. I used to say he was just there for breeding purposes, but my grandmother ran the ship, and my grandfather stood where she told him to stand. But anyway, by and by, things simmered down, and these grandparents, although they never formally adopted us, we were their children. They had had 6 children of their own, who by that time had scattered around far places. And so I remember, first of all, I became Christian when I was 10 or 12. I've always envied people who can stand up and say, on August the 12th at 4:30 in the afternoon. I can't do that, I'm sorry. I was young, that's my only excuse. And the church that I went to was the First Baptist Church of Pembroke. And we didn't have a baptistry like we have here. Ultimately, they had one, but at that time they didn't. So in the wintertime, they would save up all the people that got saved and take them to the river. There's some head nodding going on here. Well, those of you who are familiar with the geography of that part of North Carolina, the Lumber River runs through there. 2 characteristics. One is it has a swift current between 13 and 16 miles an hour, and it is full of holes. So we went down to the Lumber River for my baptismal occasion, and as I recall, it was probably 15 or 20 but there were some deacons thrown in there. And I had been baptized, and the service was over, and the preacher says, let us pray. And he started praying, and as he did, I stepped back a little and stepped in the hole. And I go bobbing down the river, and I go, oh, well, splashing in the water. The deacon turns around with his eyes closed, and I'm splashing. And my grandmother had told me that if you're in the water and you go under more than 3 times, you're drowned. Well, I'd already been under 4 times, and I'm still beating in the water. Finally, the good deacon opened his eyes and swam down and got me and brought me back. Anyway. So my experience of being in the family of God hadn't worked out too well. So. Well, by and by at that church, we had a missionary came from Africa, and she told this most wonderful story about this originally German and then French doctor, Albert Schweitzer. How many of you ever heard of Albert Schweitzer? Great humanitarian, won the Nobel Prize and all that stuff. Dr. Schweitzer was an incredible man. He had earned 3 doctoral degrees by the time he was 26 years old. At that time, he had a doctorate in theology, a doctorate in philosophy, and one other that I can't remember right now. but he felt that God wanted him to go to Africa and to be a physician for the people there. He went back to medical school, and he went to Africa to do mission work. So I was mesmerized by the concept of a missionary. And so when the time came for some other event in the church, they made an appeal for anyone who felt they were being called to full-time Christian service to come forward. And before I knew it, I was walking down the aisle to make that commitment. I should go back to the time when I got saved. I've heard people tell this story, and I'm a great proponent of children being saved. There are a lot of people who believe that a child cannot really understand enough. That is the biggest piece of hogwash. I knew fully that I was sort of at the back of the church when God spoke to me, and I stood there gripping that seat as hard as I could. And as the song went on, just as I am, Mark. And so I finally decided I had to go, and I went halfway down, and I said, and I jumped back in the aisle. and then finally went on down and became saved. Anyway, and I really felt that God was real, and that he was really with me. I learned to pray, in part because while we went to church Sunday night, Wednesday, and I reckon if they'd had another day, we'd have gone then too. And we talk a lot about Vacation Bible School, and when I was participating in helping rewrite the Constitution and bylaws for the church, for this church, I was telling the people, I came to believe that a church, particularly in a community like Hampstead or Pembroke, maybe not so much in big cities, but as churches in a small rural area not only serve the function of religion and people exercising their faith, but it's also a social thing. It pulls people together. It addresses whether somebody else is in trouble over here, needs some help, or something over there. So it serves both of those purposes. And so I was blessed to have a grandmother who we had Bible study in our home, and we would have prayers. And my grandmother would always choose me to pray. So I learned to be comfortable praying in public from that experience. I was far from my grandmother's favorite child, however. My baby brother, who was a year old at the time, you might imagine became her favorite child. I always got spanked for what he did, but I don't have time to tell you those stories, but time went on, and as I thought about how God was going to use me as a medical missionary, I went around telling people I was going to be a medical missionary. I loved sciences. I was a good student. And I made all high marks. I was thinking the other day, I ran into a guy who I hadn't seen in long years, and he said, I still remember when you challenged our agriculture teacher that he could not give an exam that you couldn't pass. All the rest of us failed it, but you did pass. So there I was, and I decided, well, I need to go to college. Wasn't a choice. My grandmother made all of us go to college. But I thought that probably should go to a Baptist college because I'd been a Baptist all that time. And the Baptists in North Carolina at one point owned 7 colleges, the flagship of which was Wake Forest. So I applied and got accepted to Wake Forest. Another little jig off to the side in God's majestic way of doing things that we don't understand. I was the paper boy for the town of Pembroke, and that's another good story. But so on Saturday, my habit was to deliver the papers earlier, and then go back and collect papers around noon sometime. Collect my money. There is an orphanage that's called a Boys and Girls Home that the Baptists own several of them around the state, one of which for a long, long time, certainly before I was born, I guess, in Pembroke. A couple named the Underwoods ran the church, ran the home, and from time to time I would stop and we would discuss some religious things and some other things. And so he had died just before I came by on this particular time. And I stopped to pay my respect for Mrs. Underwood and to collect my money. And she said, "Son, where did you decide to go to college?" And I said, "Well, I've been accepted to Wake Forest." And she just teared up. And she said, "Papa would be so disappointed because he thought you were going to go to Mars Hill." Now I'm 17 years old. I can tell you that that's a heavy burden to put on the child. So I said, well, I thought really quick, and I said, well, it's heavy because it's too late now because school started in about 3 weeks. And she said, "Miss Underwood, I'm sorry, I didn't know he felt that strongly about it. Or I would have gone to Mars Hill, lying through my teeth." And so she said, "Well, I can get you admitted to Mars Hill." I said, "School starts in 2 or 3 weeks." And she said, "Don't worry about it." The middle of the following week, I got a letter that I'd been accepted to Mars Hill. God put me where I needed to be. Mars Hill at that time was like being in church perpetually. Every one of these young people were Christians. They loved God. We had Vespers in the mountains, which my wife loves more even than I do. In the late evening, we would sit on the side of a hill and have a Vespers. There was an open air amphitheater that they built there, and students would go and pray. And in that deal, I made good friends with my best buddy was a guy that worked alongside me in the cafeteria from Charlotte, and he was running track, and he was really had made a name for himself as an athlete. And he said to me, "You ought to come out for track." And I said, "I've never run anything." And he said, "Well, you really ought to come out for track. We don't have anyone to run the 2 miles. I said, "Good grief, I'm not running any." He said, "Please come out for track." So he told the coach, and the coach called me. So I came out and tried to run for track. Coach says, "Not bad, if you think you can run 2 miles." I said, "I don't know, I never have." So anyway, long story short, I became a pretty good 2-miler. But the only thing that was open on the track was the 1 mile and the 2 mile. And I had to run for both of those. So, which is, those of you who have run much know that that's tough because your breathing is totally different. But the coach helped us out, so we would run against schools from down flatland. We'd get them in the mountains, they couldn't breathe, so we went a lot of the race. But while I was there, I guess I really solidified my commitment to live the best I could in the way that Jesus had taught us to live and to love. I didn't have much money, didn't have any money much to go to school. We lived on a tiny little farm. The people in my church took up what was called love offerings. Then when the word got around, Baptist churches throughout the association took up love offerings. And with those love offerings, and with my sister who had become a teacher by the time I finished, I made it through school and I worked. But it came to me that when I was reflecting on what had happened to me, I thought, how could these 2 old people take in 5 children with the baby 1 year old? Their children, they've raised their own children. They finally had reached a time that would be time of rest. And they two of them took on this awesome responsibility. And of the 3rd child down, here I was in college. The older one was a boy. He had joined the paratroopers and was on active duty at the time. My sister had gone to college and started to teach. But I thought, what an awful thing. How in the world would I ever be able to repay those people? And so I prayed this prayer. Dear God, thank you for letting this happen to me. I don't know how this works, but if it's possible, would you take some of my life and let them live a long life? Take however many years that is away from me and give it to them, because I love them that much. And so Michelle will tell you that the first date we ever went on, I was working in the governor's office in Raleigh, and we were walking around downtown Raleigh. And I had said to her that, I'm going to die soon, because I had lived a long time by then. And I really honestly believed that God had done his part of the deal. I was going to do my part of the deal. I don't know why I'm still here. I told Michelle the other day that I didn't know whether my living to be this old was a blessing for her, was a curse for her, but it was a blessing for me. So we've had a wonderful marriage. But as time went on, I had something happen. The scripture says man's way and God's way are not the same. I had just figured first of all, that it would be easy peasy getting into medical school. I was an A student all the way through to, a lot of hard courses, and Wake Forest is not an easy school to get good grades in. But thought I was all set. I asked Joey how long I should talk. He said, "Jim, we're glad to have you here. Talk as long as you want to. We're all going home at 7:30 though." So really, I don't know when quitting time is. When is quitting time? Somebody said. At any rate, I prayed that prayer. And I really meant it. I really am still amazed. I'm not going to ask him why when I get there, but I've had an incredible life. I was in the Navy, practiced medicine in Jacksonville, North Carolina for 14 years. The last 2 years of that time, I'll try to make this really short, I became involved with there were about 3 things that happened that meant it right directly in my being here. One was that the medical educators in the medical schools in America had decided that by the early 60s, there was so much new stuff known about medicine. Most of what we knew about medicine by that time was more than men had known about medicine from the beginning of time. So the medical educators thought that there was no way one person could maintain enough knowledge to treat people, to diagnose and treat people with all the stuff that was known. It's a foolish notion and not a true notion. So they decided that they would not train any more general practitioners. And I remember that when I was about to graduate, one of the deans asked if I would go to lunch with him, and he said to me, "Jim, I want to know how Wake Forest Medical School has failed you." And I said, "Failed me? What are you talking about? I mean, I think I've got a fabulous medical education." He said, "Well, when a good student like you comes to town and comes to medical school, we think it's a sweet little dream you have of wanting to be a GP and go to Africa. But when you leave here wanting to be a general practitioner, we think we failed." That's how much of a path they had taken. And I said, he asked me to stop calling his name years ago because I thought it was the dumbest thing that I'd ever heard a professor tell a student. So about that time, the general practitioners in America got together and said, the way we practice medicine is too important to the American people that we stop that, so we should try to make general practice into a specialty. And that happened in around the early 1970s. And so that meant that the medical schools would have to teach this new specialty. Michelle is a specialist in family medicine. I was a general practitioner, so they developed a board of that would certify those people who were qualified. Every other medical specialty that came into America, you didn't have to go through that certification process. If you were practicing surgery when surgery became a specialist, you were surgery for the rest of your life. Never had to take any more studies or anything. I just happened to have been chosen to be one of the architects of this new system on a national level. And therefore, everyone thought that I was a sort of best person in North Carolina, certainly to help educate our doctors. And then so I went around the state trying to convince general practitioners that they needed to take this certification in order to continue to practice good medicine. Well, we took the exam, and the nearest place I could go to take the exam was Atlanta, and it was hot, and we went out to Emory University, and it was so hot. Anyway, we were perspiring and gave a test that was so over our head. They had this one test that talked about, it was a parent day at this university. People came the next day, 24 people went to the emergency room with severe diarrhea. What did that mean? Which of the following? 2 died, what did that mean? And I remember going outside after that question been about, I think it was potato salad. And this doctor from Shorty said, you know what? I never did like potato salad. At any rate, so they were going to train general practitioners to become family doctors. And they were going to set up these programs around the country to, you can give me a signal when I'm going too long, to teach that. And so the people at East Carolina University petitioned the governor, the legislature, and the governor of the state to build a second medical school. They had a really fine medical school at Chapel Hill. But everyone was opposed to it who were connected with the university at Chapel Hill because they didn't want to split the money. And they had tried several times before and didn't. And Chapel Hill had been able to prevent them from getting second medical school. At a very young age of 30, in those days, very young age, I found myself president of the general practitioners in North Carolina. And so I went, the other 2 medical schools had come out against the ECU Abbott Medical School. Duke and Wake Forest had been opposed to it. The State Medical Society had been opposed to the school. And so I went to my group and I said, guys, I just took a survey of North Carolina, and the doctors practicing in the rural areas they're currently 56 years old, which means 10 years from then, they're going to be all retired. If these these medical schools don't train general practitioners, I don't know what's going to happen to the people who live in rural North Carolina. And so I was on. And I got really popular and I got a lot of press time as a president because I didn't mind calling the head of Duke University a jerk and worse names for the president of Chapel Hill. Long story short, I had the legislature finally voted to approve funding for the school. And then I was heavily recruited to leave my practice and go help start the new school. I really didn't want to do that. I said, I always respected my teachers more than to believe I could be one of them. So I went to East Carolina. And But before I went that, I'd had an experience along the way which caused me to doubt my calling to be a missionary. There was 1 year before I went to medical school, had been accepted, but school hadn't actually started yet. It was a summer that someone brought to my attention that they needed students to volunteer for the American Mission Board, or for the, for the Home Mission Board, as a experience for what it would be like to be a missionary, albeit would be in the continental United States. I applied for that, and I thought, who impossibly could be better than I am? I'm an honors graduate from one of the finest universities in the country. I became accepted to medical school, which is only one out of about every 10,000 applicants, and why would I not get the job? So I made my preparation to go wherever. I got a letter back and said, sorry, we appreciate you applying, but you have not been chosen. I talked to a counselor who historically started the first school in pastoral visitation for the clergy at Wake Forest. And he was so wonderful. He guided me to believe that one can commit to full-time Christian service, or can commit to being a Christian, and think that God is leading them in one direction. And it really is a broader calling more than that. I don't doubt, Jim, that God called you. It doesn't sound to me like God told you to be a medical missionary. You wanted to be a doctor, so it's easy to believe that you thought God called you to be a medical missionary. But there are other ways that you can serve God. So I went to help develop the medical school. And I was just there this past week where I was awarded the naming of a professorship for me that will be in the medical school in perpetuity. But when they talked about the fact that that school is the #1 school of all U.S. medical schools in producing doctors that will stay in the state that they trained in. #2 in the country in the number of doctors that will practice in rural areas, which was all my philosophy in what God, and someone said, this is your mission field. This was your mission field, that the people in the rural, underserved areas would have better medical care. That is your mission field. And so here I am. I didn't get to go to Africa. I did have the opportunity to meet Dr. Schweitzer's daughter. It's another long story, but when Dr. Schweitzer died, because some people in Boston had given him enough money when they tried to close his hospital down to stay in his work, there's a foundation that has money to keep his men alive, and they're actually in charge of his hospital. Still operates in Lamborghini, Africa. And I got invited to be on their board. and she came to one of our meetings. So I'm blessed in so many ways. Someone told me the other day that I've probably reached more lives than most people will ever have. I'm rarely at a medical meeting in this state, certainly, but also around a lot of other places, that some young person doesn't come up to me and said, Dr. Jones, you probably don't remember me. But it's because of you that I went into family medicine, and I've just been named state epidemiologist or something like that. And so it just goes on and on and on. My life's been blessed for all of these people that have gone, I think, to serve God, because I firmly believe that medicine is a calling, like ministry is a calling, because doctors have the opportunity to see people at the most vulnerable times in their life. They see you undressed, both mentally, emotionally, and physically. And it's through doctors' hands that I think God's healing is for people to be like. It's, I could stay here for another 4 or 5 hours telling you how God has blessed me personally. I have a great number of first things. I was the first Native American ever admitted to Wake Forest, first to be admitted to their medical school, first Native American to chair a department in a medical school, and so on and so on. I've been invited to help set up teaching programs in at least 4 other countries, one of which was part of the former Soviet Union, Egypt, China, just all of these things that you know. And when I think that all is from a little boy whose parents abandoned him in Pembroke, North Carolina, you understand why I feel blessed. And I thank you for this opportunity. And if anybody wants to be a missionary to take my place, preacher, you can get them in. So let me in there. And what do we want? You want to close it out?
Hang right here. So, would it be okay? Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Would that be okay? Want to ask?
Sure.
Any questions?
Did you ever see your mom and dad again?
I did. Didn't see my mother for, you got to remember, my grandmother was far ahead of the women's lib. My grandmother was a strong woman, and so my mother wouldn't have dared show up. So we didn't see her for a long time. They both went away and married. My mother went to Washington, D.C., and married a guy that was on the Capitol Guard, those people that got beat up in January. And she had 2 daughters, both of whom are now dead. But my father remarried to that lady that he'd been involved with, and they had, he's also deceased. Of course, he'd be 170 if he was. His children has 3 children for them too. So we got 2 split families. But my grandparents did eventually. I find it interesting. I always found it interesting. I was the middle child. That both of the older, all 4 of the other kids ended up having some relationship with my father. I never did. I'm sorry to say I disliked him. There wasn't anything honorable about him. At any rate, but they all ended up in Buffalo at one time or another. And the two of them graduated from school there. My two sisters taught school there. After they taught school in North Carolina. But, I never did have much of a relationship with him. I did go in the summertime when I had to have more money than I could make, working in tobacco in Robeson County, because he wouldn't give me any help with my medical education. So I had to pay for my own medication, own education. But he did have an automobile business there, and he would allow me to work there. So I worked 16 hours a day, 8 hours for him, and hours is another job in the summertime to get enough money to go back to school. So yeah.
What else? Other questions? Anybody? Really? You're almost scared, aren't you? That's what it is. All right. Well, I'm so grateful that this couple is here. What a treat it is for Ramon and I to be able to know you two and have a relationship with you and to be your pastor. It's just been great. And there's a lot more stories that he has, as you can imagine. I mean, even though he's only 52 or whatever it is, he's got a plethora of stories. Let me ask you one thing. How was it being the only Native American or the first Native American at Wake Forest? Did you run into issues there?
Oh my gosh, that's another story of God just had his hands in the whole thing. I was so naive. I didn't know. I just thought if you made good grades, you got to medical school. I didn't know you had this cultural thing and going on. And I had gone to college, and people didn't know what nationality I was, and so I would tell them that I was Indian. And at that time, there was no official tribe, and you were taught to not be proud that you were an Indian, to try to fit in if you went outside the tribal area. And so I'd make up stuff because I didn't know anything. I'd never been to a powwow. I didn't know what. So I'd make up stuff. People would say, "Well, did you hunt when you were a boy?" I'd say, "Well, I hunted with my brother. I'd run alongside a deer to see if it was fat enough for my brother to shoot." And so, and then they would say, "Well, did you hunt birds?" And I said, "Yeah, I hunt birds." "Well, we didn't have any money, so we learned to throw sticks and just knock them down." And it turns around, there was a little puddle of water. True story. There was a little puddle of water over there, and there were sparrows in it. And they said, "All right, Mr. Indian, let me see you kill a bird." Oh, mercy. And little birds, I promise you that's the true story. They would say, "Well, did you have something here you talk some Indian?" I'd make them, "What, no." And that guy says, "Sounds a lot like Spanish to me."
But you persevered, didn't
Oh,
you?
so what happened? I got to tell this one story. So I go in, and I didn't say anything about when I got to medical school. You got to imagine that people who get into medical school are all highly intelligent. Somebody said, when I'm telling the students that are trying to get in, they said, "Well, I know this doctor, he's a jerk." I said, "He may be a jerk, but he's an intelligent jerk." Because they don't even consider you if you don't make in the straight A's and so forth. So I go there, and nobody said anything to me about being the first Native person. And so they don't know, or it doesn't bother me. And it's, it is so hard, medical school. we had a couple of people who committed suicide. They've happily have changed now and not as vigorous as it was when I went on. Michelle doesn't like me to tell that story because, it's now not as vigorous as it was when she went to school. But it's a really hard time. And so you just study all the time till you're numb, and you take exams and so forth. So I'm there just studying away one night, and my cousin from Pembroke, who was 2 years behind me, was in pre-law at Wake Forest, which is both campuses are in Winston-Salem by that time. I went to the Wake Forest when the university was in Wake Forest, yeah. And tell you a zillion stories about that, but at any rate, my cousin said, are you going home this weekend? I said, are you crazy? I'm in medical school. I'm studying like crazy. He said, you gotta go this weekend. I said, why? He said, the Ku Klux Klan has decided they're going to teach an Indians a lesson because one of the white men, one of the Indian men married a white woman, and they had already burned a cross in his yard. And it says they're coming down to teach the Indians not to mess with our white women and other things. And you've got to go. I said, that's all I need. As hard as I worked in medical school, the dean finds out I went down there to start a riot, he's going to throw me clean out of here. You can forget that. He said, who's going to know that you went, it's going to be at nighttime? Who's going to know you? Nobody down there is in medical school. So anyway, I said, all right. If I get in trouble, you're a dead man. So we go down, and I walk down. Indians are up and down the streets, and somebody said to me, what are you packing? I said, packing what? I don't even own an air rifle. You guys, so somebody said, go get Jim some gun. Came back, and one guy gave me a rifle, another guy gave me a pistol. We went to this field in the little town of Maxon outside. Maxon, when the Ku Klux Klan came, they were smart enough not to put on the sheets. Then only two of them showed themselves. And this one guy had a car pulled out in the middle of the field, had one light bulb hanging down from an antenna. And people were just mad. The Indians were surrounded all around him. So one guy just had an assault rifle, looked like the kind they assigned you when you're in the Army. I think he just turned in his back and walked off with a rifle. Anyway, he put the rifle against the guy's head and said, are you ready to die? And I'm on the front row because I want to see this. I'm so stupid. It's exciting stuff. It's better than mine. And so I thought I'd get to see man killed right in front of me. So he took the gun away from the guy's head, shot out the light. Although I did a tour in the Navy, I never saw a combat duty, but I can't imagine it'd be any worse. For the next probably 15, 20 seconds, but it seemed like half an hour. There was just gunfire back and forth across that. The fact that someone didn't get killed absolutely was God's thing. So eventually it all stopped, and I went back to medical school. And I went about my business trying to forget all that. And Lonnie my cousin called me and said, we're in Life magazine. I said, you are one dead fella. So I rushed out and I buy a copy of Life magazine. And I'm opening the page up, and Lonnie and I were together, so the picture I see in Life magazine stops at Lonnie. And I thought, thank you, God. And so I go back to school, and I'm not so worried then. And the dean's secretary called me and says, Jim, the dean would like to see you. Now, I don't know. At that time, I didn't know that I was first minority. And I didn't know that. I thought maybe he was a little worried because there'll be another story I'll tell another time. But there was a lot of trouble with me getting medical school that had to do with my race. But my fellow students didn't know about that. At any rate, so I thought that's what the dean wanted to see how I was doing. He said, have you been home lately, son? I said, no, sir. I'm studying. You know how hard it is, dean. He said, well, is everybody treating you all right? Yes, sir. Can I go back to class now? He said, well, before you do, could you walk around the desk? And he's got his magazine laid out in front of him. And I thought it was just, when you bought a magazine like Life or Time or something, there was just one copy. There's a different edition. This edition, the camera took one more notch. And there I stood on the front row. And he said, look at this. This fellow right here looks a lot like you. I said, oh my gosh, that's my cousin. People have always got us mixed up. And the dean would say afterwards, he'd say, he let Jones leave his room without saying anything more to him. He said that they both knew he was lying.
Dr. Jones, I'm glad you shared that. That's what I was kind of leading you into, and you picked up well on that. But a true story, and you can actually find it out there. I found it not long ago. So, what's that? Battle of Hayes Pond. Yes, yeah. So, a couple things I pick up on with Dr. Jim Jones is his view of God's providence in his life. You know, how he can see God moving, keeping him out of some things, put him in other areas, and that's a beautiful thing to understand God is sovereign, and he doesn't use a cookie cutter kind of effect. Everybody's different, so I'm grateful that he sees that, and for his longevity in the medical field, but in ministry, because he teaches here, and again, he's only 52 years old, but he still teaches and he still serves the Lord along with Dr. Michelle, and we are beneficiaries of that, aren't we? So thank you all. Thank you both for sharing with us tonight, and we appreciate you all so much, really do. Appreciate
Thank you for the privilege.
What God has done in your life. And I'm sure if you have other questions, you can pull him aside sometime and ask him, and all of that kind of stuff, all right? So thank you all again. Appreciate it. Dr. Jones, we love you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Yep. All right, let's pray. Would you pray us out of here?
I would.
Okay.
Holy God, you are so wonderful, so magnificent, so beyond our understanding. It's hard to imagine that you loved us enough that you came to be one of us, and that you found some way to bring us back so that we could be together with you forever and ever. We thank you for this church, for its leaders, for its faithful members. God bless them all. And Father, we pray that as we remember the people in the Ukraine, that you would be there, bring that to some conclusion, save those people which we love so dearly. And we pray that as we go home, that you will keep us in your arms of safety, give us good health, help us to continue to believe that where you are, we should be, that your love abounds, and that we're so fortunate that you love us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you all.
Just say that I was a missionary to the Ukraine. I did get to go to the mission field. I was in the Ukraine 3 or 4 times, I think 4 times. And that's a wonderful people, so please pray for that country.